All right. So, good evening again, officially. I am so grateful for this opportunity to share time with you as together we explore racism in America, the history we didn't learn in school. Today, we're going to focus on part 4 of 6, mass incarceration and the war on drugs, an overview and the context of today's criminal justice system in America. As we've seen in the history described in these past 3 weeks, the relationship between African Americans and our country's justice systems, both the legal and the extra-legal one, has been one of oppression and violence. We see the harbingers of what is to come in the system of convict leasing that followed the end of the Civil War, the echoes of lynching made manifest in the uneven application of the death penalty, and the videos of unarmed Black men being killed by police bring home the continuing violence that stalks our land. The impunity with which these acts have been carried out echoes loudly in our current circumstances, although we are beginning to see glimmers of hope for more accountability and more justice. So today we will focus on the period following the landmark civil rights movement to observe what we have come to expect as the inevitable backlash against racial progress, and see how the combination of power and bigotry, the very definition of racism, shapes today's criminal justice system. So let's continue. As a brief recap of last week's class, we turned our attention to the 20th century and a number of public policy programs that were implemented and the ways in which they had discrimination embedded in them. We looked at housing segregation and the role of the FHA. We saw how discrimination in public policy, specifically in the Social Security program and the GI Bill, disadvantaged African Americans. We reviewed the Brown v. Board of Education decision and the stall and defy tactics that prevented the implementation, certainly the effective implementation of desegregation in our schools, and the corresponding echoes of that have resulted in less than optimal educational achievements by many of our fellow citizens, Black, white, and brown. We looked at the heroic actions of a number of people and events in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, and the role that television played in making visible the kinds of discrimination that were occurring under the radar, without observation by many of us until it was actually brought into our living rooms. As today, videos from cell phones are visible on our computer screens and TV screens. And we ended with a look at the steps and the actions that led to the passage of the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which marked huge advances and a ray of hope for a more equal America. And as I said, those forward movements triggered a backlash, one aspect of which we will look at this week and another next week. So when we look at the term mass incarceration, I would contend that our country has had basically 3 stages or 3 phases of mass incarceration. The first was slavery itself from 1640 to 1865, 225 years when it was perfectly legal for one person to own another and to control every aspect of that individual's life. whether he or she could learn to read or write, what work they did, the relationships they had, the children they bore, whether they could remain connected to family or be sold away. So that was our most extreme phase of mass incarceration. It was followed in the late 1800s and early 1900s by convict leasing, when Southern states passed laws known as black codes that resulted in the mass arrest, conviction, and incarceration of African Americans who were then leased out to private concerns, to mines, to railroads, to plantations, where the pay for their labor reverted to the states, and the states determined who went where. So today, in the late 20th century, beginning in the 1970s, we're going to look at phase 3, mass incarceration attributable to the war on drugs. The United States is home to less than 5% of the world's total population, yet we imprison 25% of the world's total inmates. In 1972, there were approximately 200,000 people incarcerated in American prisons and jails. And 45 years later, by 2017, that number had grown by an order of magnitude to 2.3 million people incarcerated. Today, at any given point in time, more than 7 million people are incarcerated in American prisons and jails, or they are under the control of the criminal justice system as a result of being on parole or probation. In all of this, particularly in that time period between 1972 and 2017, there has been a disproportionate impact on people of color. No other country in the world imprisons so many of its racial or ethnic minorities. And we need to step back and say, what would be the consequence if Germany were to imprison a disproportionate number of its Jewish citizens? And yet we do that with our Black and brown fellow citizens, fellow residents. Despite the fact that people of all colors use and sell drugs at remarkably similar rates, nevertheless, there is a disproportionate impact on people of color here. In fact, mass incarceration in the United States has emerged as a stunningly comprehensive and well-disguised system of racialized social control, strikingly similar to Jim Crow, a system of social control unparalleled in world history. Incarceration rates due to consequences of poverty, racial segregation, unequal educational opportunities, the presumed realities of the drug market. And when we talk about it being a system of racialized social control, one of the things that we saw last week with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made it illegal to discriminate against people on the basis of race or ethnicity or origin. But given this change in our criminal justice system, it is today legal to discriminate against criminals in every way that prior to the Civil Rights Act, we used to discriminate against people of color. It is legal to discriminate against criminals in housing, in employment, denial of the right to vote, denial of educational opportunity, access to Pell Grants, denial of food stamps, Section 8 housing, other public benefits, exclusion from jury service. So the Civil Rights Act said you can't discriminate in those ways on the basis of race, but you can discriminate on the basis of a criminal record. And so the data will lead us to ask the question, is mass incarceration a criminal justice issue, or is it a racial justice, civil rights issue? So what do we know about the people who are incarcerated? Here is a chart showing racial disparities in prison incarceration rates. This data is from 2019. And it shows that for every 100,000 people in the population in each of these categories, for every 100,000 Black people in the population, almost 1,100 are incarcerated. 547 of every 100,000 American Indian, Native American, or Alaska Native. 214 among the white population, 525 of the Hispanic population, and 46 of the Asian population. So a huge disparity in incarceration rates based on race and ethnicity. I want you to pay particular attention to this next chart because there's going to be a detailed test at the end. Well, perhaps not. This pie chart shows the allocation of the 2.3 million people incarcerated. This is data from 2023. And it shows that more than half of those incarcerated are being held in state prisons, about 500,000 people being held in local jails, and 209,000 in federal prisons and jails. Now, of that number, 350,000 of that 2.3 million people are incarcerated because of drug offenses. An additional 800,000 are incarcerated because of violent offenses. But there's a semantic issue here because in many jurisdictions, a range of drug crimes are classified as violent crimes, even if in fact no violence has ever occurred. And so there is a blurring of the line between drug crimes and violent crimes in that regard. Really intriguingly, out of that 2.3 million people, almost 500,000, 490,000 are being held in jail or prison awaiting trial. Not only have they not been found guilty, they have not even had a trial. 500,000 people being held, being incarcerated. And we'll talk later about the disruptions that occur as a consequence. So how did we get here, that 200,000 to 2.3 million? And we're going to take a look at some of the history of the past 50 years. It began when President Nixon in 1971 declared the war on drugs. One of the steps in that happening was the decision to categorize marijuana as a Schedule I drug. That's the most serious illegal drugs, along with LSD and heroin. And marijuana, in fact, until even today, is still a Schedule I drug. You may have seen that there has been an initiative recently from the Biden administration to remove marijuana from that Schedule I designation. But it was put there as a consequence of President Nixon's war on drugs. And we get some insight into that from an interview that was done with one of President Nixon's closest advisors, John Ehrlichman, who was interviewed after the fact. And he said that President Nixon saw that he had two primary categories of enemies. Those of us who were alive during President Nixon's administration recall that he maintained enemies lists. Those were particular individuals, people that he saw as his enemies. But these were classes of people. And John Ehrlichman said he saw that his two primary enemies were the anti-war left and Black people. And so marijuana, making that a Schedule I drug, was a weapon that could be used particularly against the anti-war left. And an emphasis on prosecuting cases of heroin use was utilized to deal with enemies in the Black community. So during President Nixon's war on drugs, the administration dramatically increased the size and the presence of federal drug control agencies. The first examples of mandatory sentencing were introduced, as was the concept of no-knock warrants. And we have seen a great deal of the consequence of that, even in recent years. And so that set the foundation for the war on drugs and the beginning of an incarceration of people in the anti-war left and in the Black community as a result of violating these new drug laws. And when President Ronald Reagan was elected, he indeed extended the war on drugs. And his focus on extending that war actually began, even though at that point in time, illegal drug use was declining. And this period also showed the emergence of what has been come to be called dog whistles. And we saw these in President Reagan's campaign for the office of the president. And indeed, there is a recorded interview by Lee Atwater in 1981. Lee Atwater was a renowned political operative who helped President Reagan get elected and worked with other Republican candidates over time. And he was recorded, Lee Atwater was recorded in 1981 as saying, quote, "You start out in 1954 saying N-word, N-word, N-word. By 1968, civil rights, you can't say N-word. It hurts you, it backfires. So you say stuff like force busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And a byproduct of them is Blacks get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than N-word, N-word. And so as we look back at the point in time when Ronald Reagan moved to national politics, after he secured the Republican nomination in 1980, he launched his official campaign for the presidency at a county fair just outside Philadelphia, Mississippi. That was the town still notorious in the national imagination for the Klan lynching of civil rights volunteers James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner 16 years earlier. Reagan selected that location to launch his campaign for the presidency on the advice of a local official who had written to the Republican National Committee, assuring them that the Neshoba County Fair was an ideal place for winning, quote, George Wallace inclined voters. Neshoba did not disappoint. The candidate arrived to a raucous crowd of perhaps 10,000 white people chanting, "We want Reagan, we want Reagan." And he returned their embrace by assuring them, "I believe in states' rights." In 1984, Reagan went back, that time to endorse the neo-Confederate slogan, "The South shall rise again." During his campaign, Reagan trumpeted his racial appeals in blasts against welfare cheats. On the stump, he repeatedly invoked a story of a Chicago welfare queen with 80 names, quote, 30 addresses, 12 Social Security cards, who is collecting veterans' benefits on 4 non-existing deceased husbands. She's got Medicaid, she's getting food stamps, and she's collecting welfare under each of her names. Her tax-free cash income is over $150,000. Often, Reagan would place his mythical welfare queen behind the wheel of a Cadillac, tooling around in flashy splendor. So he propagated this image of a lazy, larcenous Black woman ripping off white people, who he described as the workers, the taxpayers, the people playing by the rules and struggling to make ends meet, while brazen minorities partied with their hard-earned tax dollars. Often he would describe white voters in the story standing in line behind a strapping buck buying T-bone steaks with food stamps, while all the white person could afford was hamburger. And these illusions went on and on throughout his campaigning and throughout his presidency. And so during this time period, actually in 1985, the issue of crack cocaine surfaced. And as a consequence of the war on drugs, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 and extended it in 1988. And those laws differentiated between powder and crack cocaine. The reality is, pharmacologically, there is no difference between powder and crack cocaine, but crack cocaine is easier, cheaper to make, and typically sells for less, and is, as a consequence, the drug of choice for people at the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder. And so this Anti-Drug Abuse Act introduced mandatory minimum sentences for cocaine possession. And the mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in prison was triggered if you are convicted of possession of 5 grams of crack. In order to trigger the same mandatory minimum sentence, if you were found in possession of powder cocaine, you had to be in possession of 500 grams of powder cocaine, 100-to-1 differentiation. And the introduction of these mandatory minimum sentences meant there was no room for judicial discretion, no room for circumstances or conditions. It was simply applied based on the conviction. And so the power in the criminal justice system under this situation shifted from the judge to the prosecutor, who made the decision about what to charge. It was also up to the prosecutor to describe whether the case would be tried in state court or federal court. And the consequences of being tried in federal court were much more draconian. And so different groups of people were directed to federal courts as opposed to state courts. And 95% of those who were referred to the federal courts pled guilty to a lesser sentence in the belief that if they went to trial, they would receive the mandatory minimum sentence. So I'm going to go back for just a little bit to 1915, which was a notable year in race relations in the United States. That was the year that marked the release of D.W. Griffith's notorious Klan-glorifying blockbuster film, Birth of a Nation. It romanticized the role of terrorist posses in the post-Civil War South, and it created a sense of nostalgia for those wonderful days pre-war of white supremacy. That Thanksgiving, 1915, William J. Simmons gathered 15 men to initiate what became known as the Second Klan. They climbed to the summit of Stone Mountain outside of Atlanta, Georgia, built an altar of 16 boulders on which they placed an American flag, a copy of the Holy Bible, and an unsheathed sword. Then they raised an enormous wooden cross and set it on fire. Following this Klan resurrection ceremony, the group held regular events there. In the 1920s, the Klan began fundraising with the United Daughters of the Confederacy to erect an enormous Confederate monument on the mountain's face, carvings of Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson, and Robert E. Lee. For most of the 20th century, the Klan held their annual Labor Day cross burning at Stone Mountain until 1991. In fact, Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, I Have a Dream, included "Let Freedom Ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia." It was so renowned for its association with the Klan. So against this backdrop, as the election of 1992 came near, presidential candidate Bill Clinton was shaping his tough on crime campaign message, thinking that that was an essential part of being elected. And so he arranged a photo op just before Super Tuesday. Clinton traveled with Georgia Governor Zell Miller, Senator Sam Nunn, and Congressman Ben Jones, and gave a press conference standing in front of a phalanx of jumpsuited inmates from the local Stone Mountain prison. And you don't have to look too closely to determine the racial composition of the group of prisoners arrayed behind candidate Clinton. So the symbolism was hardly subtle. And indeed, during President Clinton's administration in 1994, Congress passed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, one of the harshest laws ever passed in US history. It provided that children as young as 13 could be tried and sentenced as adults. It introduced the 3 strikes you're out rule. If you were convicted of 3 felonies, that 3rd conviction, your sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. And in the intervening years since that provision has been on the books, more than half of those people who have been sentenced to life in prison without parole because of a 3rd felony have not committed a single violent offense, yet they will die in prison. And 13-year-olds sentenced in this way will die in prison. This law introduced new capital crimes for which the death penalty would be imposed. And it increased funding for state prisons. It provided $10 billion to fund new state prisons, and it provided $11 billion in funding for state and local police. And so the intensity of the application of the criminal justice system accelerated here. Now, a year later, Congress commissioned a bipartisan US Sentencing Commission because there were those who were disturbed by a number of the disparities in US drug laws, most notably the cocaine crack to powder disparity. And so the Sentencing Commission came in and made a report recommending that that disparity be reduced because they had concluded that there was a racial bias in the sentencing as a consequence. But Congress overrode the recommendation of the Sentencing Commission, and that 100-to-1 discrepancy remained in place until the passage of the Fair Sentencing Act in 2010. And that law reduced the disparity from 100-to-1 to 18-to-1. So you still can be in possession of 17 times as much powder as crack cocaine. and the mandatory minimum sentence will not apply. It's intriguing to step back and look at some of the drug-related issues that have arisen more recently. One is what is referred to as the opioid epidemic. And it is typically described as a public health issue. It is an addiction, it is a drug use, but it's not criminalized the way that was done during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And indeed, we are seeing now the growing number of states that are actually legalizing the use of marijuana. So what would have happened had we treated crack addictions, cocaine addictions as public health emergencies rather than crimes? What if we had not treated marijuana as a Schedule I drug? But how did all of this come about? Because after all, the police were presumably busy arresting people for crimes, testifying in court, keeping order in the various jurisdictions. How did this emphasis on drug laws occur? Well, incentives were created in these federal laws. In 1982, federal cash grants were made to make the enforcement of drug laws a priority for state and local law enforcement agencies, because it was not typically federal law enforcement agencies that were making these arrests. And so cash grants were given to encourage state and local law enforcement agencies to make drug arrests. In 1984, a really significant event occurred, and I don't think any of us knew anything about it. In fact, I didn't know what the federal civil asset forfeiture law was until I started exploring this war on drugs and the mass incarceration that resulted. The way the civil asset forfeiture law works is that beginning in 1970, a law was passed that said if a drug arrest is made and drug equipment and drugs themselves are seized during the course of the arrest, that becomes the property of the arresting organization. In 1978, it didn't just have to be what you seized at the time of the arrest. You could seize money and securities that belonged to those who were arrested. In 1984, it was expanded to say that the government could take real property when they made a drug arrest. And in 1986, it was further expanded to say you could take property equal to that involved in the drug trade if that were no longer available. So the government began seizing assets that were worth a great deal. And in 1984, when this law was passed, it changed how those funds were used. Up until 1984, when any of these assets were seized during a drug bust, the value became available to either the federal government or the state or the local law enforcement agency, and the value was put into the general budget. So it became another line item of income for the federal government or for state budgets or local budgets. But in 1984, this law changed it, and it said that the law enforcement agencies retained the value. It would no longer go to the general use for the budgets. It was money exclusively to be used for law enforcement. And that year also, it provided for something called equitable sharing, where if someone from a local law enforcement agency participated with the federal government, then the two together would benefit from the assets that were seized, that were forfeited, bypassing state laws that said, no, 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 this should go for the general welfare. And so once this law took effect, Those funds were used for law enforcement equipment, weapons, salaries and overtime, training, travel expenses, informant reward money, detention facilities. In 1986, after this new law went into effect, $93.7 million across the country became available for law enforcement agencies. And in 2013, the value of the assets seized was $4.2 billion. And so those funds all became available in 1988 for burn grants that were made to states and local organizations if they would create narcotics task forces. In the 1990s, the federal government began using this money to make cash grants that would reward the number of drug arrests that were made by state and local law enforcement agencies. And in the period from 1997 to 1999, those assets that were seized, the value derived, resulted in 3.4 million orders of Pentagon equipment, war equipment, being delivered to state and local law enforcement agencies, which is why we see some of the images today when there is a confrontation between police and citizens. And in many instances, the police look like they could be going to war in Ukraine rather than patrolling an American city. But there have been other elements of collateral damage in all of this. And one of the most significant has been the assault on the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment to the US Constitution reads, "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized." And so I recall any number of years ago when there would be a trial and there would be evidence presented. But it turned out that the evidence was found in a garage of a house when the search warrant only described the house as the place to be searched. And so the evidence could not be admitted because the warrant was not particular in describing the garage. Well, a series of Supreme Court decisions beginning in 1968 began to chip away at the protections of the Fourth Amendment. The first was a landmark Terry v. Ohio decision, and the court substantially expanded police power to search and seize and limited the right of privacy to individuals. Prior to that decision, it was generally understood that the police could not stop and search someone without a warrant unless there was a probable cause to believe that the individual was engaged in criminal activity. But that Terry decision expanded the idea of warrantless search to include suspicious behavior as probable cause. And so the Supreme Court affirmed that police officers could interrogate and frisk suspicious individuals without probable cause for an arrest. And that Terry rule was used to target African Americans for wearing flat brim hats and hooded sweatshirts as suspicious behavior, allowing stop and frisk. In 1996, that power was expanded in a case, Wren v. United States, when the court further limited the privacy rights of individuals by allowing law enforcement the ability to stop a person in a motor vehicle on the basis of a pretext and then search the car. And so this allowed police to use minor traffic violations as a pretext for baseless drug investigations. And that produced an incredible increase in the rate of stop and frisk. And the racial bias in stop and frisk has been documented repeatedly in the years since these Supreme Court decisions. Part of the collateral damage of this increase in incarceration from 200,000 to 2.3 million is the disruption of the social relationships, of marriages, of families, of parents and children, of jobs, as people are arrested, 500,000 in jail awaiting trial. We know that another aspect of the collateral damage has been the militarization of the police, and we have clearly seen the use of excessive force, often documented in police shootings of unarmed Black men with impunity. And all of this has clearly eroded any form of trust in what a number of police law enforcement organizations see or say is their mission to protect and serve. And it builds on those images we saw from the 1950s and 1960s, where the fire department and policemen became the agents of violent discrimination. And so we have seen an explosion in life sentences without parole. That sentencing has quadrupled since 1984. One of the interesting aspects is that if you are sentenced to death as a result of conviction of a crime, you are by law entitled to an appeals process, and you are further entitled to legal representation if you cannot afford it. But if you are sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, there is no guarantee of appeal, and there is no guarantee of legal representation. And so the vast number of people who receive that sentence do indeed die in jail. The other thing we know is that the criminal justice system is being fed by probation and parole, because correctional control extends far beyond the time you spend incarcerated. More than half of those 7 million people under the control of the criminal justice system are on probation. Another significant number are on parole. And in fact, in the state of Delaware, violation of probation is sufficient to revoke probation, and you are immediately re-incarcerated. And so statistics from a recent year show that within 3 years of release from prison in Delaware, 75% of those released will be re-incarcerated, and a very small fraction of them will have committed another crime. The immediate action, if you are arrested for missing a meeting with your probation officer, for being found with alcohol or in the presence of an individual you're prohibited from interacting with, or that you did not notify the probation office of a change of address, which often happens frequently as people are released on probation. The next step is reincarceration. And so one of the things that has happened has been a huge increase in the number of people incarcerated, as we saw, an order of magnitude increase. So even though that 1994 law provided $10 billion for the construction of more prisons, in fact, during a time period following the passage of that law, a new prison was opening in the United States every 2 weeks. But that was helpful to states in the construction of the prisons, but it didn't do anything to help ameliorate the costs of the housing and the feeding of all of those prisoners. And so that burden, that cost burden, became significant. And as a consequence, states turned to private for-profit prisons. There is always a capitalist solution to any problem. And so in 1998, there were 5 for-profit prisons in the United States. By 2008, 10 years later, there were 100. And their profits that year increased by 500%. So many of us have operated in a for-profit enterprise. We certainly know how it works. We know that in a for-profit system, typically compensation and reward to those who are responsible for managing these institutions, they are rewarded based on the amount of the profit. The greater the profit, the better performance, the better the compensation. And we also know that the formula for profit is income minus expenses. And so you have to ask yourself, if you're the head of a for-profit prison and you know how your performance is being judged and how your compensation will be based, how much of the income that you derive from housing these prisoners are you going to expend on programs that prepare them to successfully re-enter the community when their sentences are completed? Because those dollars that you spend will reduce your current year profit. And if you want to be particularly cynical, you might say, how successful do I want these people to be when they re-enter the community? When if they're not, they'll be back and they'll be a source of income to my top line. In any case, in most criminal justice institutions around the country, very little, clearly nowhere near enough is spent on helping people successfully re-enter the community when their sentence is completed. Finally, when it comes to the issues of racial discrimination, there have been a number of studies done. Not a lot of them have been very broad-based, but in 2016, a judge in the state of Massachusetts, Ralph Gantz of the Supreme Court of Massachusetts, took a look at the data and saw that the state was locking up Black people at a rate nearly 8 times that of white people, and Latinos at a rate almost 5 times that of their white counterparts. And he wanted to know why that was. Was it truly that Black people committed 8 times more crimes or Latinos 5 times more crimes? And so he commissioned Harvard University to do a study over the course of a 4-year period. And they looked at more than 1 million cases. And what the data showed was that for every 100,000 Black people in the population in Massachusetts, 665 were incarcerated versus 82 of every 100,000 whites. Indeed, 8 times as many. And when they looked at the population of the state, Black people made up 24% of the population of Massachusetts, but they were subject to 63% of the people interrogated, stopped, frisked, searched. Latinos made up 12% of the population, but were subject to 18% of those encounters. More people of color were detained without bail. Their bail was set higher. They were charged with more severe offenses and were more often referred to Superior Court, where the federal mandatory minimum sentencing would take precedence. And they found, in looking at the details, that the average sentence of a Black person was 168 days longer than that of a white person convicted of the same crime. They could not come up with a single factor, not poverty, not family demographics. No other factor explained this differentiation other than race and the power of discrimination in the criminal justice system. If you're Black and charged with crimes carrying a mandatory minimum sentence, you are substantially more likely to be incarcerated and receive a longer sentence, especially if they find drugs or guns. Black and Latino people charged with drug offenses and weapons offenses are more likely to be incarcerated and receive longer sentences than white people charged with the same offense. Interestingly, although Black people are charged with higher offenses, more serious offenses, when they get to court, Black defendants are convicted of charges roughly equal in seriousness to their white counterparts, despite the fact that they faced more serious initial charges, higher bail. Massachusetts cannot be alone in this. And so what we see in today's criminal justice system has been a horrific erosion in Fourth Amendment rights that ultimately may affect every single one of us, regardless of our race. The criminal justice system itself is racialized at every step in the process, from beginning to end. The rate of stops, the rate of arrests once a stop is made, the severity of the charges that are placed, the availability or the rate of bail, the availability of legal representation, the likelihood of reaching a plea bargain rather than going to trial, the severity of a sentence, and the availability of appeals. And so what we know is that the criminal justice system in the United States is in desperate need of reform at all levels, federal, state, and local. Police reform, bias training, body cameras, use of force standards, transparency of information. There is work underway to put these elements in place, and they are desperately needed. It is important for us as citizens to be aware of these initiatives designed to make the criminal justice system more just and to demand action.